Philippe, I want to begin with you, actually, and also try and bring Vera into the room. She's not here, and I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about some of the conversations that you were having in relation to this conversation, and in a way where your two researches meet. I mean, they came together in this extraordinary pairing of the painting and the quote at the end. But if you could just talk a little bit about your conversation, so we can make a further bridge between Vera's and yours presentation.
I think Vera is doing PhD research on Southeast Asian regionalism, and she's trying to find commonalities or echoes or some Southeast Asian substratum to aesthetics from the 1950s till the 1970s. And along that way, I think she encountered, of course, the Bandung Conference as a political catalysator of these connections, which are, in fact, if you see the countries of Bandung, there were very few actual African countries present because most of them were not yet independent. So from some African countries, there were delegations, but they were journalists and were not actively participating in the political part of the conference. So it's a conference which was hosted by Sukarno, UNU, and Nehru as the sponsoring leaders of sponsoring countries, meaning it was really like the gravity point was South and Southeast Asia. And I think that is where Vera's research evolves around. Also how this kind of like there are more movements. There are also later movements from in the region. They're called the emerging forces movement, or and that's, I think she uses these different political attempts to create a regional solidarity as a framework for her research in art, and she's trying also to find if within that art, which is of course a form of modern art, like, but how, let's say, not just iconographically, but how, let's say, a Southeast Asian substratum as an attitude would emerge in the imagery. And that's why she also invokes Buddhism at the end of her talk. My research is kind of like maybe encountering hers when it comes to the Bandung Conference. I'm working on a project where it's for a United States museum, so we look more at what are the parallels between the civil rights movement, African American solidarity movements, literature and art, and are there echoes with the decolonizing movements that are kind of like epitomized by Bandung, because it's my project. I don't want to go to the non-alignment because I think the non-alignment is a smokescreen that dilutes the kind of like the specificity of the Asia-Africa solidarity movement, which was Bandung. And so I look, in fact, the project is called The Color Curtain and the Promises of Bandung, but I date it backwards. It's the 1955, 1929. We start with the League Against Imperialism, which was founded by a German with the first edition in Brussels and the second in Frankfurt. And so we look at where people like Senghor and Nehru and Mohamed Hatta, the first Indonesian prime minister, were already present in the 1920s. And that League Against Imperialism dissolved with the advent of National Socialism. And so there is a gap in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and then Bandung kind of picks up from there.
You began with evoking the spectre of comparisons, the Anderson book. And this is a question for Haseeb, and I suppose also a kind of meta question for the conference that one maybe we can open out. You talked about the kind of the constitution of the Ummah, this unifying identity. I wonder, and as I say, it's a question to myself as well, how productive is this idea of a comparison or idea of parallels and affinities when we're thinking through different forms of, constitution? Where do you see it play out, and how generative do you think it is?
I think.
Switching
on. Hello. Yeah. Maybe I can borrow that. Sorry. Hello. Yeah, it's on. But anyways, I think the overall argument I was trying to make is precisely how we need to see all of these things as entirely historically situated within their particular moments and in their contexts. So if we see like the rise of some of the things which I talked about, for example, the organization of Islamic cooperation could also be a materialization of something called like pan-Islamism, which has to be understood as something which grows out of out of a constellation of the Cold War, especially in the 1970s, where there's an attempt to find a different type of alternative political formulation, new modes of alignment that are somehow outside of U.S. and Soviet spheres of power. And I think this is also what the non-aligned movement and maybe what the Bandung Conference is also an attempt towards, But I think when those attempts are made, for me, what's very interesting is, okay, you try to formulate a new center of power, another sort of sphere, but what measures do you need to take to constitute that political that polity, let's say, especially when it hasn't existed before? And in the case of the Ummah, it's something that it requires a kind of anachronistic gesture of projecting itself back through history. Which I try to show has never actually existed, and that's also a hallmark of right-wing movements, that's of National Socialism, trying to redeem the redemptive power of as a kind of anti-modernity, anti-capitalism, redeem something which had been there, and bringing it back, So this is, yeah.
Philippe, do you want to speak to that? The question of the spectrum of comparisons. I mean, you evoked it in the beginning of your talk, but I was wondering if you could tease it out a little bit further.
Well, for Benedict Anderson, he started with his theory of the spectrum of comparisons after reading Noli Me Tangere from José Rizal, Philippine author of the 19th century. And there is a scene in Noli Me Tangere, it's the opening scene, in fact, where a character returns to the Philippines from Spain and is looking out of the window to the botanical gardens in Manila. And he's annoyed by something that happens to him, that he cannot look fresh at them anymore without having constantly the image of the botanical gardens of Madrid. And that's the kind of thing, like the specter of comparisons is the spectral presence of a reality far away, be it in time or in place, when observing or when tackling a specific thing. And maybe that's when we bring it to today, there is always this extreme violent reaction when we compare political events that happen today to the 1930s. And of course, if you go to the litter of it, the literalness, they are not to be compared, but in a context of the specter of comparisons, we cannot get rid of this kind of presence of the other events that are far away in time and maybe far away in geography. And in that sense, I think it could be Benedict Anderson wrote about it to generate something productive, to be able to compare things that on a first sight, scientifically, you're not allowed to compare.
And I think Haseeb, you outlined this very clearly now in the diagram that you presented, in the way that things re-emerge, but in a very different guise, or in a different guise. That they shouldn't be seen necessarily as repeats, but as different iterations or different resonances of history.
Yeah, I think, I think that this notion of history as a spiral is something that comes from Hegel, which was then as Aufhebung and then politicized through Marx, and then something that has an interesting lineage within the left. So then, indeed, propelled with Lenin, and in that case, it's not really a theory, but it's this attempt to act before something will occur. To take control of the dynamics of history. So not simply like look in retrospect at the similarities which are occurring and have a descriptive mode of relationship with their political moment, historical moment, but actually to act ahead of it. Which is this notion of the vanguard, that model of politics. And indeed, there's a certain type of optimism to that. And but what I think it means is it employs the possibility of incorporating elements that may not have been considered, that are not part of the political narration that is typically, that you'd have typical groupings of. So maybe in this case, a conference like this is probably a good instance to look for those unlikely similarities or, in that sense.
Super. Do we have any questions, or maybe it's time for some fresh air? Maybe take the mic just for the recording.
No, just perhaps to connect this to the Olivier and also the previous session. Try to think about this comparison in terms of archive, for example, as Olivier mentioned, but also perhaps as Lisa also said in terms of connections, intersectionality. She didn't mention this in this, but do you think this connection in terms of archives, for example, or perhaps you in terms of, just to, if you comment a little bit more on that, you perhaps are telling more in terms of dynamics, proactive thinking. I don't know, how would you see that? Just to comment a little bit more on that. I'm making connections with the other one. Thank you for your presentations.
In terms of archives, I would maybe approach that very pragmatic and literally. There's a big task, or also my partner at this moment is doing, is that for a lot of protagonists, the Indonesian sources are not known. And a lot of the information I got comes from a very recently published book, Indonesian Notebook on Richard Wright, which the Richard Wright scholars and the Richard Wright archive in United States never had access to, because they were written in Bahasa Indonesia or in Dutch. And this is still a big work to do in order to kind of complete the archive, not make it exhaustive, but to complete it as a project. And I think that's important. For Genet, the archive is known and mostly worked by Mr. Dichy. And so this kind of bringing them together was kind of making, I don't know, my own assemblage in a certain sense. It exists for his, about the novels, Notre Dame des Fleurs and Native Son, but the travelogues have never been really compared by scholarship. It's kind of I'm not an academic, I'm a curator, so it's something I would try to see how to do that in an exhibition form or in a archival, I don't know yet, through the work of people like Bushra and Kojo, to kind of make that, how do you say it, bring it on a level that it becomes significant, this comparison.
For me, this notion of the archive, I just say I'm most excited when I encounter models in archives, not only architectural, but because they have this projective capacity. They're into a future which they want to procure, or through the past, and that speaks to a certain worldview that's kind of contained within them, rather than, I think sometimes for me it can be quite fragmentary, and I think you do a much better job of incorporating those, but it's those aspirations that I'm most curious about.
I think there's one question at the back.
Yeah, I would like to ask something about the presentation and about what Couture did with the series of photography when he tried to redo a book. And I think there is something that could be, to come back to the idea of a black archive, for instance, there is in that a practice that we can consider as what DJs are doing, for instance, the possibility of replaying an archive instead of considering that we have to keep them in a certain state that we imagine is the original state. Kojo did also work inspired by Fred Moten about the sonic aspect of photography. So imagine that there is a sonic dimension in the black archive that there can be heard, but we have to listen to photography to try to imagine a sonic dimension. That means that archives are not artifacts totally complete, but have to be repeat, as we say, playing with a record for music, for instance. So just imagine that archives have to be played and to become vivid. And it's coming back to the spiral. I was super inspiring by the spiral question because it's a really Caribbean tradition too, to consider that a kind of actualization of an archive is based on coming back in, and add some layers. So there is not a real verticality in the Caribbean culture, but more a practice of repeating and replaying that we find, of course, in the sound system in Jamaica, for instance. And so I'm super interested by the idea of so-called in France reprise, or a replay of an archive, if we consider that we are not there to preserve them, but to replay them in the present and try to understand what it could mean to play that kind of visual music in the present. So I think, yeah, finding it really inspiring in that way.
Thank you. I think on that note, we will take a break. I want to thank Haseeb, Philippe and Vera for their presentations. Okay, thank you.